The dollar is the world reserve currency. It is an exorbitant privilege. It's been the tail that's wagged the dog of the world since 1944 for good and bad reasons. But like every empire, it's now debased its dollar to such a level. It's gone into so much debt. The gold is replacing the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. dollar as a reserve asset.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for June 3rd through June 10th, 2024 while supplies last. First, we feature 2023 1-ounce Gold Britannia at just $59 over spot. We also have backdated 1-ounce Silver Britannia at $3.10 over spot. Next, we have pre-33 XF Gold $10 Liberty coins at just $59 over melt. And finally, we have a highly limited supply of 1/10 ounce Platinum Britannia at $59 over melt. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We are delighted to have this widely followed returning guest. Matthew Piepenburg is a partner at Von Greyer's, which was formerly Matterhorn Asset Management. He joins us this Thursday, June 6, 2024. Matthew, thank you for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
It's great to be back. It's the anniversary of D-Day, and I'm actually here in France, so it's a big day for America and France. I just realized that as we were talking.
It is. These are sobering times to recall. We live in a community that is well populated with veterans. And we just marked Veterans Day on Memorial Day and so on. And this is something that we think of not just for U.S., but for all of our compatriots all around the world who have been standing up for freedom in their beloved countries. That's one of the things we're going to get to later in this talk is who are the so-and-sos and how have they distracted and misled so many of us and often led us into war at times as a cover story for the destruction that they've already wreaked in our financial lives and in our societal lives and at the end stage of empires, that sort of thing. We care deeply for all the beloved families all around the world who are affected by war, and we hope with all our hearts to avoid that in the future, and yet know that we're swimming against the tide of history with the guard that we have in charge. So, first of all, if we could, with your help, look at some of the clear and present dangers that are coming our way. They're playing out as mathematics and history would predict about the destruction of our financial edifice, the fiat currency regime that's in present all around the world, not only the U.S. dollar, this race to the bottom with all countries feverishly trying to devalue their currencies and monetize their debts and so on. I'd like to get your biggest examples that you'd like people to make sure that they are aware of the destructiveness of this and the progression, the rate at which it's progressing.
Yeah, no, these are big and very important questions. And as we discussed even before we went live, the truth is the facts haven't changed. They've just gotten worse. The key drivers of the big issues, what's affecting fiat money, whether it's the US dollar, the yen, the peso, the yuan, whatever, all fiat money is an embarrassing ice cube. And certainly since the US reserve currency, the dollar, went off the gold standard post Bretton Woods and then went off the gold standard in 71 under Nixon, all major fiat currencies, including the US dollar, are losing their purchasing power day by day, month by month, year by year in a slow drip. Now that slow drip is kind of accelerating. So when you're looking at paper money, which is how the vast majority of the world still measures their wealth, especially in the West, to answer that question, you have to look at bond markets and you have to look at rate markets, and they can get kind of wonky and boring, but you also have to look at politics. But most importantly, you have to look at debt. You always have to start with debt. And when you get to levels of debt that cross the Rubicon of rationality, and you throw out numbers, 120% debt to GDP, 6% deficit to GDP, 35 trillion almost now in public debt, et cetera, et cetera. We could go on. Those numbers feel like figures you memorize and you throw out to look smart, but there's a living, breathing reality behind those numbers. And history confirms the dangers of those debts. And so when, again, looking at basic history, whenever country crosses the Rubicon and gets past that debt threshold of 100% debt to GDP, problems exist. When your debt levels, when your interest expense on your debt alone surpasses your military budget, it's not fable but fact. That's a leading indicator that you're broke. Your country is a banana republic. It's hard in the world where the U.S. is still supreme and still respected for all its past greatness and its current weakness. It's hard to see that, and it's hard to understand that, but it's important to look at it objectively. And it's not just the math and the history, it's the signs all around us, the social unrest, the fourth turning, these, whether you're Rickards or Casey or Neil Howe or even myself. History does matter. It's easier for people to grasp when you go through these empire changes. And I think, it's these late stage empire themes is you've got debt and then you've got wars, which of course we're seeing proxy wars or direct wars right now. You have a decadence, a cultural decadence where everything is permissible and everyone's me first and everyone's a victim, and there's tribalization, splinterization, which is only made worse by inflation and social unrest. And then, of course, you have currency debasement to pay off that debt. And then, of course, after all that comes the opportunists that are either demagogues or dishonest politicians, left or right, and then centralization. So all that's around us. But again, this all is a ripple effect of debt. And whether you're looking at recession indicators, which you can battle, or whether you're looking at inflation rates, which seem to be all over the map, depending on which version of inflation you want to trust, and whether you're looking at the bond market or the currency market, and particularly the US dollar, the evidence is literally everywhere. And it fascinates me that that's not more understood. But the debt level is why we have to monetize it with artificial liquidity. And that artificial liquidity is usually just said, well, that's QE or money printing or frankly, mouse clicking at the Eccles building. But it's more than whether the Fed pivots to a rate cut or throws in the towel and admits to direct QE. Liquidity, which is fake and inherently inflationary, is everywhere. It doesn't have to be an official QE announcement. In the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen indirect, I call it backdoor liquidity. It's a shell game. I think it's important for people to understand that it doesn't just have to have the Fed mouse clicking trillions at the Eccles building for it to be inflationary. Currently, the Fed is hawkish and QTing or tightening its balance sheet theoretically and keeping rates high. But in reality, if you look under the hood, get past the smoke and mirrors, without direct Fed QE, we've had indirect QE through the repo markets. We saw that in 2019, even before we started weaponizing the dollar. We've also emptied the Treasury General account 2 or 3 times since 2020. We did it in 22 and 23. We had the BTFP program, which was an indirect bailout of the bond market because the banking crisis of 2023 was really a bond crisis. Then we've used the reverse repo markets, and now there's this sexy little term that the fancy lads on Wall Street call supplementary leverage reserves, which is just a fancy term. SLRs are just a fancy term for commercial banks to do QE for the Fed. They get 0% cost of borrowing. They get a 4 to 5% coupon, but they effectively have unlimited leverage to buy unwanted U.S. Treasuries, which is what the Fed is supposed to do. But now they're slipping that into the commercial banks. And there's other little tricks happening right now. There's regulations changing at in Basel right now to allow more leverage and more sovereign bond buying globally. Even Freddie Mac now is looking at second mortgages being guaranteed, which is just another way to put more liquidity into the system. So there are still trillions and trillions of dollars of liquidity out of nowhere. In other words, more debt paid for with more debt. And so eventually the Fed, I think, will go to direct QE when the markets start to really go under. That's what really triggers them. But when you combine these backdoor shell game, artificial kind of, I call again backdoor QE with actual QE, which I feel is inevitable. All of this is just one more way of adding more and more water to that glass of wine and devaluing and debasing the flavor of that wine. We're doing that to the dollar. So the dollar, despite the milkshake theory and all this, in all its strength in SWIFT and all the euro dollar markets and all the things that absorb that dollar, I think, like Jeffrey Grunlock, the trend is going to be a weaker dollar into recession in the 100 to 108 range in the DXY. That means the purchasing power is going to get weaker for the dollar, as it's done ever since 1971. I think we're going to monetize our debt with more inflation. I think the like every debt-soaked nation, the U.S. will inflate its way out of debt, and of course that really is robbing from the people. That is open theft. I joked the other day with Adam Taggart, if I wanted to join a country club and look really good and buy the best suits and get a really nice car to show up and pay annual memberships up the nose and show off my success, but then hand that bill to my children or grandchildren so that I could enjoy the country club, I don't think I'd have a really strong legacy in my family album. I think people would look back at Grandpa Matt and say, what was he thinking? But if you think about what the U.S. government has done with its debt policies and its fiscal policies, spending infinitely more than it earns, and then solving that by debasing the currency and misreporting inflation, that inflation, and we can get into the wonkiness of the inflation, that inflation is a tax. And when you combine that invisible tax on whatever taxes you are paying overtly, especially the middle class, which is really the working poor, that's the sign of a dying empire. And that should be foremost on people's minds. But again, they're listening to the experts with the little flags on their collars and, be calm, carry on, inflation's at 3.5%. Well, again, it's not conspiracy theory. Let's be blunt. Again, we're looking at currencies, we're looking at markets, we're looking at inflation, but come on, the CPI scale is an absolute comedy. Everyone knows that. It's never right, but it's always correct because it's the official number. But look what we did in Jackson Hole in 2022 with supercore inflation, which is just inflation with X energy, housing, and food. Well, that's insane. That doesn't help us at all. And now they have all these other new tricks for inflation. They've got headline CPI X shelter. They're even trying, the Fed and the BLS are trying to do 3 to 6 month average inflation, but that backfired because it actually went up even higher. So there's all these tricks. What does it even mean? And Larry Summers, who I'm not a huge fan of, but nevertheless, even Larry Summers, a former assistant treasury secretary, admitted if you use the pre-08 or the pre-08 housing metrics, we're looking at 18%, 17% inflation, which is actually how it feels. But even John Williams at Shadow Stats, we're probably at 8% if you use the old Volcker model. So however you look at it, whatever time you bid on a U.S. Treasury or corporate Treasury or even a junk bond, you're still losing money. It's a defaulting bond. It's a negative returning bond with real, honestly reported inflation. So these are boring things, inflation, invisible tax. But every American, whether they understand the Fed policy, whether they understand all the backdoor QE tricks, or whether they understand the BLI, I call it the CP lie, regardless of that, they feel it. They feel the inflation. And it's very important to remind all of us that the inflation rate is a rate of change. It's not a price level change. So when we go from 9% inflation, CPI official, to even 6% or 3.5% year to year, it doesn't mean everything's going down. You're still compounding. That means in the last 3 years, prices have gone up 15, 16%. That's the official number. So the actual number, the honest number, is significantly higher. And again, all viewers everywhere around the world, and Americans in particular, know that their $20 bill or their $100 bill or their $10 bill doesn't buy nearly enough this year as it did even 2 years ago. So that is an impact. So these debt policies are more than just a case for gold or real money as opposed to fiat money. It's more than just a case for sound money or transparent honesty from our government. It affects your lives. And I know here in France, and I'm back and forth all over the place between Europe and America and Asia, but here in France, I have neighbors that are apple farmers and cattlemen who can't take their kids to Paris this summer because the cost of the tolls and the gas is just too high. So that is a European Euro phenomenon, but I know it's the same in the US. People are having to make real hard decisions because the cost of living and the CPI scale are completely at odds with each other in reality, and they just don't have the purchasing power that they used to. So again, all these things affect us. It gets way before we get into gold and real money and government dishonesty. Inflation is not an academic debate. It is a social force, and it leads to social consequences. And that inflation is a direct result of our Federal Reserve, which was conceived in Jekyll Island in 1910 and signed coercively into law by Woodrow Wilson in 1913, and has destroyed our country generation by generation by taking over the power, constitutional power given to our Congress to fix the price and supply of our money, which was supposed to be a silver coin when the founding fathers came up with our Constitution. Now it's a fiat dollar that is literally a melting ice cube. It is a death by 1,000 cuts. It is a slow drip, I think, usurpation or theft of hardworking Americans trying to get by. And they're being robbed by their own misreported inflation and their very dishonest, drug-addicted, fiat money addicted government that still thinks you can solve a debt crisis with more debt and keep postponing that so your grandkids pay the quote unquote country club bill.
I think you've pretty well laid that out. Do you feel in a summary that it's fair to say that inflation is theft from the people to cover the sins of government.
Absolutely. If you have a fixed rate debt and then you debase the money and you have inflation, you're basically getting out of debt for free. I mean, anyone who had a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage at 1% or 2% is actually okay with inflation right now. But they have other problems. But the government, like all governments, without exception, whether they're democracies, monarchies, oligarchies, in some form, from ancient Rome, 1789 France, and I've said this, Yugoslavia, the 90s, Weimar, every government debases its currency to get out of debt. And who does that hurt the most? The average citizen. Certainly hurt the Argentinians, but the only difference between Milei and Biden or whoever comes into the White House next, left or right, but certainly every president I've known since Nixon, the only difference between Argentina and every president since Nixon is Milei is at least telling it out loud. He's saying the quiet part out loud. He's admitting it. And the other thing that's interesting is the people aren't afraid to hear it, because there's two issues. First, as a population, you got to stop believing the sweet little lies of your politicians and central bankers. You've got to accept that they're not really being transparent. And you got to be willing to have austerity and reprice and rethink things. Milei can do that because the Argentinians are beaten down and they're ready to hear the truth. And there's someone actually willing to speak the truth. We don't have that in the West right now. We still have finger pointing, blame a bad guy, blame a virus, blame Martians, blame COVID, whatever. It's never blame the bathroom mirror for our policymakers who think debt is good for them. And so I think that's interesting, but it is theft, and we need a stronger leadership to be honest about it. Just like in a family, you tell your wife, you tell your kids, this is our income. We can't take the trip to Hilton Head this year because, and you got to be honest. And everyone in the family trusts each other and they tighten their belt. But we don't have that kind of honesty at the government level. We don't have that kind of accountability. And that's obvious now. People are discouraged left or right, I think. They know that. And certainly people who understand gold and real money and the store of value that gold is understand that. And they understand history. Not enough people do because for a number of reasons. But I think that's changing slowly as things get more and more ridiculous. And the recession that we pretend isn't here. Again, all these metrics you can look at mathematically. We can look at the leading indicators. We can look at the yield curve. We can look at credit card average debt at 23% right now in America. That's appalling. That's an appalling percentage. It shouldn't even be allowed. You can look at delinquencies. You can look at bankruptcies up 35% this year. So again, whatever the official recession is, like whatever the official inflation is, it's just words replacing really bad, dishonest policies. And I think more and more people see that. You don't have to be in your mother's basement doing Google searches. You're not a conspiracy theorist. This is right in front of us. I think more people are figuring that out.
Yeah, I wish, I'm thinking of the movie Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey, where he had like a certain period of time he had to tell the truth. Everything had to come out of his mouth, had to be the truth. And it's like if everything out of the officials' mouths had to be the truth for going forward, what would we be calling? Like, we wouldn't use the term quantitative easing. They'd say, well, looks like we're going to have to steal from the people and from foreign bondholders to pay for our debt. And so it doesn't seem that lesson is lost on a lot of the world. We have the BRICS Plus countries who have been talking openly, leaders from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, saying those who have their best interests in mind would do well to stop doing their business in the dollar and holding on to the dollar as a store, or holding on to U.S. treasuries as a store of value. Can you discuss with us, you are all over the world, living in Switzerland, traveling to every continent, what you're hearing outside the U.S. about the awareness of what the U.S. is trying to pull, although a lot of governments are trying to do the same thing, but we just have been doing it maybe longer or harder than others.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I literally have been in Africa. I've been in Asia and I've been in Singapore. I was just came back from Istanbul. And you do, again, I caveat by saying I'm a very proud American. And, let's keep that very clear. I still don't prefer any country in the world more than I do the States. I'm in Europe for different reasons. I'm raised binationally, but I'm a patriot. But that doesn't mean I'm not critical of things. And one of the advantages of being overseas most of the second half of my life and traveling a lot for what I do with Von Greyers is, in Asia, in Turkey, in Europe, I get different views. The Eastern understanding of money is very simple. They're very calm. There's not a plan B to de-dollarize. It was a plan A all along. They've been waiting for America to get over its skis in debt, weaponize its dollar, and give Russia and China the excuse to start what is now a clear trend of de-dollarization, the details of which and the evidence of which are everywhere. the dollar is the world reserve currency. It is an exorbitant privilege. It's been the tail that's wagged the dog of the world since 1944 for good and bad reasons. But like every empire, it's now debased its dollar to such a level. It's gone into so much debt that gold is replacing the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. dollar as a reserve asset. I mean, as a savings asset, the U.S. dollar is a spending asset. But when I talk to people in the East who own a lot of gold, whether they're in Turkey or whether they're coming out of Middle Eastern countries or whether they're in China or even Russia, the world wants an asset that can't be taken away and that retains its value. And that doesn't mean they have to create a new world reserve currency. It's not going to be the yuan. It's not going to be the ruble. It's not going to be the peso. It's not going to be the euro. I'm not saying the world reserve currency changes overnight, but its trust and hegemony has changed irrevocably, and so they will save in gold, and when they need a fiat currency to buy a house or pay for a wedding, they'll sell a little bit off, convert it to current rate, and spend for liquidity, which is exactly, by the way, what our clients do at Von Greyer's. The bulk of their wealth is in grams and ounces, not fiat money, but we need fiat money to buy things. So when the dollar gold price is at 2,400 or 2,300, 1,800, 1,900. We sell a little bit off and we buy, and that's the way to use gold, and that's what the world is doing. And again, this is not a gold bug argument. You look at the world since 2014. In general, central banks are net buyers of gold and net sellers of U.S. Treasuries. And that process only accelerated at a much more rapid pace when the U.S. had the brilliant idea of weaponizing a neutral reserve currency against a country the size of Russia, a nuclear power clearly in trade bed with China and the rest of the BRICS nations. So if you look at the average central bank purchasing prior to the war and the weaponization, I think that was at 118 tons. It was still way above average. Post-Ukraine, post-weaponization, that's now, I think, 291 tons. So the average amount of central bank gold buying, which was already net buying since 2014, really accelerated after 2022. Again, because the trust in that world reserve currency, now weaponized and politicized, on top of the fact that it was debt-soaked, is making that dollar less and less trustworthy. That's just simply the truth. And the other evidence of that is beyond central bank purchasing and the embarrassing decision to weaponize against a major power like Russia is, look, typically, every man on Wall Street will tell you that the real headwinds for gold are when you have, positive real rates, inflation under control, and the U.S. dollar relatively stronger than other currencies. We've had all three of those for traditional headwinds in front of gold, and it's reached all-time highs in dollar terms and every other currency. So gold is breaking away from these old Western correlations, these old Western excuses, and that's because regardless of positive real rates, regardless of controlled inflation, or regardless of a relatively stronger horse in the glue factory in the DXY and the dollar, no one trusts the dollar. No one trusts that IOU from a debt-soaked sovereign. And so gold is hitting all-time highs despite these headwinds. And that to me is only because trust in that. It's like anyone. You wouldn't borrow from someone who is so far, you wouldn't lend, to someone who's so far in debt and can't repay it without paying you back in a debased IOU. It's just, the evidence is there. And again, the people in the East who get a different media or who have a different conversation at dinner or see a different conversation at the family office or at the banks, they have a different view than the West. The West fundamentally and intentionally misunderstands gold. That, again, is not a gold bug argument. You're a product of your environment. The business schools and the undergrad and econ courses don't talk about Austrian economics or sound money or what really goes on at the Fed. And, we weren't taught that. Ronnie Sturfula from Vienna was certainly taught that. And folks east of Vienna were taught that. And I'm not, again, pro-Russia, pro-China, but they were taught that. They know that you can, as von Mises warned, go into such extraordinary debt without the subsequent destruction of your currency. That is true throughout history. It is basic math. Again, it's not meant to be condescending, but the West still throws this Keynesian playbook out there. But even Keynes himself would not agree with the level of debt we're at today. And even Keynes himself warned against weaponizing a reserve asset. Robert Triffin warned against this. We seem to be doing things intentionally to destroy our currency and destroy our country. It fascinates me. And outside of the U.S., people see it especially outside the U.S., like Russell Napier, or Ronnie Sturfling, anyone else who understands sound money. This is obvious to them. Or a Turkish banker understands this, or an East European economist understands this. But the narrative in the West, like so many of our narratives, actually looks more like Pravda circa 1950 than it does like the truth. And it even looks somewhat, darker than that even. And so that's the great irony. That's the great sadness for a patriot, because you want direct information. You want both sides of a debate on, Austrian versus Keynesian economics about what debt is sustainable, what debt is not sustainable. Have a real discussion about these things. How will the Fed pay 1.6 trillion in interest this year at these current rates? Just an interest expense alone. How will they do that? How can they do that if no one's buying our U.S. treasuries on a net level? That means something has to give. They're going to have to, through backdoor direct QE, monetize that debt. That's not a gold bug argument. That's simple math and politics in a blender, and we don't hear that on CNBC. And Don Lemon couldn't explain that if you tried to teach him that. And if you looked at just Biden's chief financial advisor, this was famous. I think, hopefully it came out in the U.S. It was all over the press here, could not explain quantitative easing. He literally couldn't explain quantitative easing. That's not just an anti-Biden comment or something. That's just embarrassing. That's unacceptable. And there are many people who think that the government or the bankers are evil. Well, that's a debatable issue, but they're certainly stupid. That is unacceptable. Evil or stupid doesn't work for most of us. We want something better than that. And again, it doesn't even talk about my bias, which is clearly a bias for sound money, but it goes back to my grandparents and anyone else who understood money. It's not a bias, it's a conviction. But even if you take the gold argument out or the Bitcoin argument out, this should be obvious. It should be obvious if you have a busboy salary and a Ferrari appetite and you spend with debt and you give that bill to somebody else and they don't have the money, they're going to have to counterfeit that money. To me, QE is legalized counterfeiting. That's really what it is. When it's taken to this level, debt can be fine if it's in moderation, but when you go to the abstract levels we're at now, history reminds us empires disappear. They don't die, but the Dutch, the British, they're still here. And the Spanish and the Habsburgs, they're still here. Those systems, those governments change, but their hegemony changes. 150 years ago, England and the British pound sterling was everything. It's hard for the West to imagine a world where the American dollar and the American way of thinking about debt and politics is somehow a threat. And history is very easy to look at 100 years in the rearview mirror. We're living through history right now. It's hard to see when you're right in the middle of these seismic shifts, which really began in 1913 when we bring in the Fed, 1971 when we got off the gold standard, but 2022 when we weaponized the U.S. dollar. Boy, as Grant Williams and I said from day one, and Jim Rickards and many others, I'm not alone in this theory, that was a watershed moment. We shot ourselves in both feet and the elbow and probably the coronary artery. That was a disastrous decision because no one trusts us anymore, even our friends, even Saudi Arabia. They don't. They're doing currency swaps with China. 20% of world oil sales last year were outside of the U.S. dollar. Unthinkable 3 years ago. Now that's the new trend. That petrodollar shift is it's another vertical stovepipe. You could spend hours focus on the implications of what happens when the petrodollar system gets weaker, or when the COMEX runs out of physical gold and silver to short the market. When Basel, these things are worth an hour each, but they all point to a world moving away from the dollar and the ability of the LBMA banks and the COMEX banks to manipulate and put a permanent short, as Andy Schectman knows better than anyone. Tracks this brilliantly. But these things between the COMEX and the petrodollar and the U.S. Treasuries being net sold on the central banks and gold being net bought, you don't have to be a gold bug to see the writing on that wall. And you got to get past, these are gold guys talking their book. Challenge everything I'm saying, or Andy or anyone else, or Ronnie Sturfield or Grant Williams. Challenge it. You should be informed. But if you get informed, read books, pro and con, fight debate, up dollar, strong dollar, weak dollar, inflation, deflation, Bitcoin, gold. If you do your own homework, again, not just listening to me or someone against me, you'll figure this out on your own. And I think more and more people are. And that's great. To me, that's great.
One of the things that emerged to me as you were describing this whole plethora of examples was to ignore what people say, but follow what they do. The actions speak louder than words. We have all kinds of sayings in our culture that underscore the truth of that. People know it in their gut. So could you talk to us for a moment about, because we could sit here, we literally could sit here for the rest of this entire day, and it would be through your night, I'm afraid. And we could say, well, look at over there. That's a lie. Look over there. That's a lie. That's a lie. That's a lie. That's a lie. Okay, fine. We're surrounded by lies. There's a house of cards, and it's all held together by a glue of lies. If we look at what people are, those who are not sleepwalking, those who are not entranced by that house of cards and those group of lies, are doing, what they're actually doing. You mentioned one key turning point was when Nixon closed the gold redeemability window for the US dollar. That there's stories that France was taking shiploads of gold for their dollars back to France. Can you talk to us about repatriation, physical repatriation or acquisition of gold by those who aren't sleepwalking right now?
Well, look at China, look at Russia, look at Saudi Arabia, look at the UAE, look at what they're doing. And not just what we're saying. We're not even talking about what they're doing. We don't want to talk about that in the Western media. The legacy media has absolutely no credibility. That's pretty true, left or right. Look at Saudi Arabia, for example. Again, I say the famous, when Biden calls MBS or Saudi Arabia a pariah state, that's not good for an ally. Whatever you think of Saudi Arabia, again, there's a lot of problems with it, but they are an ally for oil and they are an ally for our necessary petrodollar. You shouldn't be calling them a pariah state if you need them to be selling oil around the world in US dollars. And so when you look at what's being done, Biden going to Saudi Arabia, getting a fist pump. When Xi shows up, he gets a firm handshake because Saudi Arabia is going to be selling oil to who needs oil the most? China. And they're going to be doing it through all types of swaps and currency issues and gold things on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. That is a trend away. Look at what Switzerland's biggest export to Saudi Arabia was this year in Q1 already and going into Q2. It's gold. And I know, I've tracked it in Switzerland. It's going to Saudi Arabia. Why is Saudi Arabia stacking gold? Why is Russia stacking gold? Why is China stacking? What are they doing? Why are central banks selling U.S. treasuries? Look at what they're doing. They're doing that just like if you, and I've said this many times, if you're a history buff and you lived in Pennsylvania and you saw Robert E. Lee's army crossing the Potomac, coming into Maryland and heading towards Harrisburg or Gettysburg, what are they coming there for? It's not to throw a garden party. There's a battle coming. They're coming across your border. You know something's coming up. When you see these other countries, the BRICS countries, stacking gold, the central banks stacking gold, they're preparing for something. They're not getting ready for a dinner party. They're getting ready to see gold as the new reserve asset, not the U.S. Treasury, not the U.S. dollar. That doesn't happen in one night. Just like Gettysburg or the Civil War wasn't 3 days only. It was part of a larger process. You have to look beyond the next Twitter feed or the next YouTube video to see the trends happening. Again, history is harder to see when you're in it than when you're looking back on it. You can debate about Vietnam when you're in it, but when you look back on it, now even the veterans would say there's a problem. I know veterans of the Iraq War who are questioning that war, and that wasn't that long ago. So again, we're in it right now. We're seeing it right now. The smart people in the West and the East recognize what this means. And the sad reality is, as an empire, we are debt-soaked. As an empire, we're in those 4 stages of decadence and debasement and social unrest and political centralization, from the Patriot Act to quantitative easing. We see that. From central bank digital currency to these weird speeches we see with Marines on each side of the president. We feel that centralization coming. It's hard to see. When you see these type of actions, though, of China, which the World Gold Council's report on China's actual gold holdings is fictional. Our definition of a recession is fictional. Our definition, as we talked about earlier, of inflation is fictional. The Patriot Act is not patriotic. Quantitative easing isn't easing. So there's all kinds of examples of what they say versus what's actually occurring. You've got to look at what's occurring. Even Janet Yellen and Jake Sullivan, they've basically upturned 40 years of central bank policy. They're admitting we're going to run inflation hot and we're going to weaken the dollar. And as I talked with Brent Johnson, we're discussing the U.S. dollar. My argument is that the U.S. needs a weaker dollar. They need a weaker dollar because 8 trillion U.S. treasuries are being bought by foreign individuals. They can't buy that if the dollar is too strong. So there's all kinds of forces going on. And watch what I say versus what I do. The most obvious example is that inflation's under control, or that we're winning the war on inflation, or that, first of all, inflation is not transitory anymore. So in other words, the argument that we're winning the war on inflation or we're trying to raise rates to fight inflation is what they say. What they're doing is 180 degrees the opposite. And that is they need inflation. They misreport actual inflation that run negative real rates because anyone who is in charge of a debt-soaked country, I would do the same. I would just say it honestly, though. Folks, we're running inflation hot because we blew it. But they won't say that. It's pathologically impossible for a central banker, which is just another name for a politician, or anyone in the White House or the Senate who doesn't understand economics, to admit that we're broke, that we're going to debase the currency, we're going to stick it to the middle class in particular to get ourselves out of debt. That's what they're doing. It's not what they're saying. Because if you look at actual inflation, we are running negative real rates right now. Actual inflation, not reported inflation. We're running negative real rates. We've been doing it for years. Powell knows it. My argument, it was never honest. And the only reason we're tightening our balance sheet and raising rates is when we actually can't deny that we're in a recession. When the markets sell off, then we're going to need to really reduce rates and fatten our balance sheet. All Powell is doing is reloading his two revolvers. Higher rates so he can cut them, lower balance sheet so he can fatten it. That's what he's doing. He is not honestly trying to fight inflation. He needs inflation.
If we could talk for a moment about, because our channel is called Liberty and Finance. We've been talking a lot about finance, but it's tied to truth and freedom. We've been talking about truth. The believing that we are created in the image and likeness of our Creator, and that true freedom is, Jesus said, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. So the idea is we're being denied the truth. And also the idea that freedom is not freedom is for all. Freedom is to be everywhere. It's for everyone, for individuals to freely choose what they want to spend or not spend, to save their in sound, honest money, that sort of thing. These are there's scriptural junctions against denying the working man the fruits of his labor and the proper wages. That's one of the sins that cries out to heaven for vengeance. So these are the things that are transpiring, and yet the solutions that are being proposed, again from on high, are more centralized. Central bank digital currency, and that's a central control of interest rates, rather than just, no, do what you want, make what you want, create what you want, trade with each other in whatever currency you want, and save in something that's stable. And what does the government have to do with that, after all, as far as being able to tell you what the cost of your money is, et cetera? Can you talk to us about that idea of freedom versus centralization, and what looks like is planned for our future? More freedom or less? More centralization or less?
It's very important what you're saying, because and it's sad that we have to even apologize for taking a moral, even a Christian or spiritual attitude, because that's not sophisticated. That in and of itself, going back, just for Christian viewers, I talked to Muslim viewers or Muslim folks in Turkey who don't understand usury. They are against usury and interest rates, and they have certain values that are very similar to Christian values. And the Judeo-Christian tradition is certainly in the New Testament. When was the one time you saw Jesus angry? It was with the money lenders. And they had to use silver to pay off the man to betray Christ. These things are mythological, spiritual, religious, Christian. They're Judeo-Christian ethics that were the core of our founding fathers. And our founding fathers' principles were certainly based on the Enlightenment, whether that was Christian or not. They were based on enlightened principles of freedom. Now, I happen to be a Christian, but I don't apologize for that. But you don't have to be to value morality or freedom or ethics, which our founding fathers, whatever their spectrum on the Christianity scale was, did have one thing in common: freedom. Whether you were from Virginia, South Carolina, Philadelphia, or Massachusetts, we had sadly misunderstood freedom when it came to slavery. That was a disaster. But the ideals, not the practices, but the ideals were all about freedom. And the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, before we even had the Constitution, said when Mad King George is a totalitarian and centralized, it's your duty to resist. What's ironic today, and some would argue, is our own government is the Mad King George today. They're not being honest. They're stealing. There is taxation without representation because we're getting screwed by inflation and we're getting taxed. As Rick Rule said, you can look at the CPI, but then add taxes to that. That's another problem. So this freedom concept, every American was taught to believe that and taught to value that. We've forgotten how to notice that we're losing that. And one of the most obvious evidence of that is dishonesty. Well, debt and inflation is an impingement on your freedom when you're being taxed invisibly. This central bank digital currency telegraphing that's been going on since 2020 is another look what I say versus what I do. Efficient payment systems make all your assets a liability in the Fed balance sheet. You won't have to worry about bank failures. We'll be a safe payment system. But what is central bank digital currency but more and more control? What is that? That, again, as countries go through debt, and they get deeper and deeper into debt, they become less and less free, more and more controlling. There is no exception to this throughout history. And sadly, even America is no exception. The hope is, as Americans in the Jeffersonian sense become more informed, more educated, they'll be able to BS detect the dishonesty or the ignorance of the financial leadership as it currently is, ask harder questions, demand more accountability, and hopefully without pitchforks and revolution, we find a safer, more honest, direct type of government. That I don't know if will happen. I'm kind of cynical. I hope it does. But between our inflation narrative, our CBDC narrative, and our foreign policy, which since I was born is either a direct or proxy war somewhere in the world, which again is another symptom of a failed empire. When you get over your skis in debt and you're too lost in the expenses of war and your military budget becomes your largest line item, that's usually, as the British Empire and the French Empire, and certainly the Germans can remind you, is usually a bad sign. So we are kind of, history is not repeating itself, but it's rhyming in a lot of ways. Again, I don't want to be too gloom and doom, which I still believe there are folks that can help us out of this, but the real power is in the grassroots and the people. And if the people are more informed and getting their information selectively and not from, I'm sorry to say, the legacy media, the fourth estate has failed America. That, again, without trying to get too dangerously sensational, what is the definition of fascism from Mussolini on down? It's the perfect marriage of government and corporations and information. And as Baron Rothschild said, if I control the money, I don't care who's in power. If you add to that who controls the information and the narrative, if you control the money and the narrative, you control the masses. But if the masses see through this, they have more power than they think, and they can bring better people in. And then those better people will rule with more honesty and accountability. And then Americans or any citizen, when they trust that they're being talked to honestly, they'll be willing to make sacrifices when they're being told the truth. Then they'll make sacrifices. Americans on June 6th of all days are certainly capable of making sacrifices for the world and for themselves. That greatest generation is not an exaggeration. But we're a long way from Kennedy when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but you can do for your country, because we don't trust our government anymore. So we're not willing to do the same things. We want someone to speak as honestly to them as we're willing to do for, to us as we're willing to do for them. Americans, like many nations, are capable of great things when they're being led by great minds. And I just don't think it's a debate anymore that the leadership right now is not inspiring. And the policies out of our central bank, if you understand it, as Henry Ford said, if you understand how it works, boy, you'll ask harder questions to your representatives.
I don't think that's what Henry Ford said. I think he said there'd be a riot in the streets by tomorrow morning.
I'm toning it down. Yeah, I don't want to get you deplatformed.
Yeah. Well, there's another quote that I thought you were going for in the middle of all that, which is certainly befitting. It's been arguably attributed to Vladimir Lenin, and then others say no, it was actually George Maynard Keynes after he interviewed Lenin, said the way to crush the bourgeoisie is to grind them between the millstones of taxation and inflation. The middle class is certainly feeling that crushing feeling, and the millstones of taxation and inflation are what you've been educating us about. And you've also hinted at this several times, is that then at the crisis point, I gave away the punchline, at the culmination of this, usually when it becomes the secret is out, people know that in their guts that they're being lied to and that they're being played, and that there's no way out for the existing regime to keep playing their same playbook and surviving, that we're all going to be hurt very badly. Then a crisis is fomented often, and now everybody look over here, distracting from the true accountability and the true remedies to the true root problems. And oftentimes that is carried out through divide and conquer strategies, where you create chaos, you encourage tribalism. People are already stressed, so we tend towards in-group preference and tribalism when we are stressed, because that's been a survival skill that got us this far as a human family. But anyway, that we have lots of evidence that this is actually being funded, organized, fomented in the right now, and especially around presidential election cycles in the U.S., et cetera. In the face of that, how you said something just a few moments ago about how we need to not fall into that, not fall into our baser instincts, but instead look to people who are going to tell us the truth, because they will draw the greatest from us. Words of wisdom from you on what people can do now so that we don't get snookered in this next decade here, to fall into just going for the bait of whatever the new crisis is that the regime wants us to keep following along, because it's just going to lead us further down the road to destruction.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I mean, again, It's a very important question. I don't have all the answers, Dunnigan. I mean, my moral instinct is stop fighting over petty differences and start seeing the human common denominator. Tribalism is how countries end, how nations end. That's, when I talk to folks in the Middle East, when I'm in Africa, they say, well, one of the reasons Africa, with all its natural resources, we're so tribalized. We can't cooperate as a continent. We can't cooperate as a people. The Middle East, the Muslim countries have not, Shiite, Sunni, they haven't been able to cooperate. And that's maybe slowly changing. I never thought I'd see America this divided, whether it was on race, class, sexuality, politics, everything. Now it's almost, if you were trying to find a recipe to destroy America, you create a TikTok account, a Facebook account, a Google account, and find ways to spread ways to hate each other more so that we're divided. We are so disunited right now in the United States. I've never seen anything like this. I can't believe we're still talking about white nationalism. That's really a problem. It's certainly racism is a problem, but I think it's gotten worse, not better, because we've made identity politics the key. And there was Tony Ute at NYU, a brilliant thinker who sadly passed away, sick, terrible illness, who was a Jewish man who talked about how we can't let identity politics affect what happens in Israel or Gaza. And then, he was very controversial for saying that. I don't think Martin Luther King would be a big fan of Black Lives Matter right now, the way it's projected. Again, this doesn't make you racist or unracist. I don't think we're making progress. I don't think Gandhi would be very proud of what's happening in the Middle East either. But the sad thing is, when you had great leaders, including Gandhi, including Martin Luther King, including JFK, including RFK, what happened to these people? That's the cynical part. The people that were brave didn't last long. And I wonder how, Milei will do in Argentina as a litmus test, because he is, whatever you think of him, he's certainly blunt. His lifestyle is a little weird, but he's blunt. And the people so far are willing to take that. I think the words of wisdom for Americans is, let's come together as America. I sound like a politician. Let's be Americans first, not white or black, rich or poor, left or right. And we all agree, all Americans, that storming Omaha Beach, whether they were from a wealthy family or a poor family, a Democrat family, a Republican family, were Americans that day, that morning, and the years and months that followed. We've lost that. Eisenhower was certainly a hero on this date in history. What did he warn against in 1960, 61 before Kennedy came in? The dark state was what he was really warning about. He was warning about the military-industrial complex. That's just another name for when the government is no longer led by representatives, but by something that's unelected. I think we can all agree that's a problem. Maybe, there's still hope, but that's a problem today. I think we can all agree that, who's really making decisions in a White House where your president can't finish a paragraph without a prompter or walk 20 yards without assistance. That's not trying to be mean or anti-democrat or pro-Republican. We all know there's a problem when our choices are so divisive that we don't have one person that really galvanizes us. And I think that's a problem. But again, we're getting away from gold and silver. We're talking about things that are just my opinion. But I think that your opinion is shared by a lot of Americans. And my words of wisdom would be, let's be Americans first, not some identity group. We're just losing. We're all going to lose that way. We're being suckers to the people that are trying to manipulate this kind of fracturization. And it's very hard when you're financially stressed, when inflation is there, when the Fed has destroyed the middle class, literally in the last 30 years, destroyed it. It's very hard to be hopeful and optimistic. I've heard it so many times. You stand in the rain long enough, you'll get in anyone's car. You'll believe anything. And I think that's a trick. I think we're better than that. Left or right, rich or poor, black or white, whatever. What all the things that divide us. We're all human. And as Kennedy said, we all love our children. We all want to avoid war. I think Lindsey Graham and John Bolton can send other people's kids to war. They're not sending themselves to war. I'd like to see them in a foxhole, not my son. But again, it's very easy to puff your chest in D.C. and declare how strong you are when it's other people who have to make the sacrifices. And as to our military, as we started, I know more people in the military than I know on Wall Street from my family and my background in my hometown. And they are absolutely lions being led by donkeys, and they know it. They know more of that. So, it's not about heroics or ethics. We have it in spades in America. We're just divided right now, and that's too bad. It's too bad that we have to debate whether Leah Thomas is really a women's athlete swimming in UPenn. I'm amazed that we have to debate this. It has nothing to do with being transphobic. It's just being fair. To me, again, that's going to polarize some people, but I can't believe we're spending this much time on Leah Thomas when we have 120 deficit to GDP, when we're fighting about TikToks and tweets, and our government's broke, and we're talking about central bank digital currency, we're talking about a war in the Ukraine, we're talking about a hot war with a nuclear power, and we're talking about a currency that's losing 98% of its purchasing power since the day I was born, and we're fighting about these things, and our government's walking around debating about nonsense, when we are broke, and our currency is getting debased, and our middle class is being eclipsed. They are the working poor, not the middle class. And what's our solution to them? Fannie or Freddie Mac's going to give you a second mortgage. You can take out more debt, buy a jet ski, and get deeper into debt, so you'll believe anything they tell you. I think we're better than that as a country.
So I'll use the same question that I used earlier as far as not watching the words, but watching the actions, and what, rather than just falling trap into these meaningless debates or fruitless debates or debates that are not vital to the future of our children and grandchildren, what are the critical actions you see that very simple that people, maybe others in other countries around the world that you've traveled, are already doing those other things as far as holding on to real assets and et cetera, and establishing real skills and have real relationships and that sort of thing. But what do you see as keys to surviving and thriving in the challenging times ahead for people that are in the U.S. and in this melee of misdirection and lies?
I think at the intellectual level, Rick Rule said it best, at this conference when we were in Vancouver: invest in yourself, get informed. Doesn't mean follow Matt Piepenburg or Dunnigan or Ronnie Sturfula or Egon von Greyers or Brent Johnson, whatever, or Rick Rule or Peter Schiff or Larry Lepard. Get informed on your own. That's the most important investment you have to make. My other advice is to follow John Kennedy's maxim: there's something immoral about abandoning your own judgment. So stick to your own judgment, but make it informed. And towards that end, that means turn off the legacy media, left or right, and start looking at real people who are experts in certain fields, whether that's military, whether that's politics, whether that's finance, whether that's markets, whether that's sound money. Look to the people that are brave enough to speak their own minds. You can debate, you can challenge, you can go Bitcoin versus gold, whatever, but get informed. Don't just certainly don't follow the legacy media. In my opinion right now, don't follow 95% of our Congress or Senate who have no understanding of economics. The other thing, of course, again, with my bias, understand what is sound money. What are sound money principles that many in the East know and many in the West are starting to figure out? That doesn't mean you have to put 100% of everything you make in gold and silver. Again, I'm not here. You don't have to be a client of Von Greyer's. Get informed about what's happening to fiat money, how fiat money works. Look what happened in 1944 at Bretton Woods. We were a gold-backed currency. Why did we get off that in 1971? Why in 2001 did the WTO offshore all our work to China and Central America and Mexico for lower wages and kill the middle class? We said, it's going to be great. China's going to be buying all our American goods. No, China makes all our American goods and sells it back to us because our CIOs sold out the middle class and labor in the Midwest so they could get cheaper labor somewhere else. Look at these trends. Look what we just did in 2022 when we weaponized the world reserve currency, and other countries are now leaving the US dollar, the evidence of which is everywhere. It's not just a headline scare tactic. De-dollarization is very real. It doesn't mean the end of the world reserve currency. It doesn't mean the end of America. It doesn't mean the end of the dollar. It just means a different dollar, a different America, a different world reserve currency. It's not being replaced. It's being repriced. If it's being repriced down, what can you do to ensure it? Some would argue Bitcoin can do that. We don't have time to get into that debate. 80% of it is the same as the gold debate, and then it goes in different directions. But if you understand that fiat money is a problem, you have to look at hedges against that risk. That can be in real estate. That can be in art. That can be in physical gold. It's been that way since way before the Old Testament. So it's there. Consider it. The fact that gold has beat the S&P since 2000, the fact that it's outperformed every other market in a bear market in the last 15 since 1929, the fact that its annualized return is better than the S&P. And yes, you can look at different periods, but gold makes sense. It makes so much sense, in fact, it's not discussed in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, or at the Fed, or certainly in Congress. So you have to ask why. Why is that being omitted? It doesn't mean it's the only answer, but why is it not talked about? Where it's talked about in the East, much more. Why is China and Russia stacking gold? Why is Saudi Arabia taking gold from Switzerland? Why are they getting outside of the US dollar and petrodollar? Why? Ask yourself. You don't have to just listen to me or you or any of the other guests, but you have to get informed. You have to make your judgment. You'll feel far more free, no matter what the world does to you, when you have your own judgment. And I think that's up to each citizen. You don't need a freaking MBA from Wharton to do that. You don't need to go to Princeton to do that. You just have to be curious. If you're just going to be angry and emotional and throw out a tweet and hate some other group, you're not doing yourself or anyone a favor. I think, those are my words of wisdom. It certainly doesn't mean follow Matt Piepenburg's view and you'll be fine. You challenge it all day long, but get informed. And I think if you understand the history of sound money, you'll find that we have a lot in common. Bitcoiners have a lot in common with gold owners too. And there's a whole other discussion there. But to me, gold is the obvious stable asset. I'm not looking for convexity in Bitcoin. The US dollar is great for liquidity, but it's certainly not a reserve asset. It's not a savings asset. It's what I use to buy gasoline when I have to buy gasoline. But I store my wealth in grams and ounces, not in paper.
We've been speaking with Matthew Piepenburg, a partner at Van Graaerts. Matthew, if people want to find out more about what Van Graaerts does and how it can help them, how should they get connected?
Yeah, our website is vg.gold or vangraers.gold, either one. And we have a lot of free information there on certainly all our interviews and articles from Egon and myself and Ronnie Sturfula and other advisors that come on. We also just educate for free. Now, we have higher minimums. We're not for everyone, but we certainly speak to everyone. And it's not just, why gold, which is very important, but also how to own gold and frankly, how not to own gold. And one of the ways we don't believe you should own gold is in a commercial bank, not at all. And we don't even think ETF gold. I think you have to have physical, whether you hold that in a Folgers can, a safe deposit box, or a vault in Switzerland's up to you. But understand gold is there. And we talk also a lot about how to own gold. And it's a free education. That's just step one. You should look at other places too. Check out other arguments for and against gold or for and against our opinions. But I think it's pretty objective. We certainly speak from conviction, but we have a strong bias for physical precious metals.
Folks, if you don't want to miss a single episode with Matthew or with any of our other guests, make sure you're on our free mailing list at libertyandfinance.com. That's all spelled out one word, libertyandfinance.com. Just put in your email address, click submit. Make sure you confirm on the confirming email. You'll get one email in your inbox per day with our latest interviews and any weekly specials. Matthew, on behalf of all of our viewers and guests and subscribers, thank you for joining us on Liberty and Finance.
Well, it's certainly my pleasure. I enjoy it.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for June 3rd through June 10th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 2023 1-ounce Gold Britannia at just $59 over spot. We also have backdated 1-ounce Silver Britannia at $3.10 over spot. Next, we have pre-33 XF Gold $10 Liberty coins at just $59 over melt. And finally, we have a highly limited supply of 1/10 ounce Platinum Britannia at $59 over melt. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.